In the summer of 1940, the war in Europe was already over. At least it appeared to be for the Allies. In just 6 weeks, Germany had defeated France, and with it, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. By July, Great Britain stood alone, and in Washington, leaders were beginning to realize that the events unfolding in Europe might not stay there. The speed of Germany's advance shocked military planners around the world. The fall of France revealed something troubling. Modern warfare could move faster than anyone had expected, faster than the United States was prepared for, and in Washington, leaders were already looking ahead to what might come next. If Britain also fell into German hands, the Third Reich would gain access to one of the world's most powerful navies, adding its strength to an already formidable war machine. The Atlantic Ocean, once a barrier, could become a pathway, placing the Western Hemisphere within reach of future attacks. By mid-June of 1940, as France stood on the brink of surrender, Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall and the General Staff reached a conclusion. The time had come to bring the National Guard into federal service. In Washington, concern turned into action. In September of 1939, as war began in Europe, the standing army of the United States was less than 200,000 men, ranking far behind the major powers of the world. Even after the first wave of expansion the following year, the United States still had fewer than 300,000 active duty soldiers, while National Guard units, though already organized and trained, remained under state, not federal, control. For a nation watching a global war unfold, this was not enough. In September of 1940, Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. At the same time, something else was happening. National Guard units across the country were being called into federal service. These units already existed, made up of men who had trained together in their home communities, often for years. But much of that training had been built for peacetime. What lay ahead would demand something far more intensive. The draft would build the army of the future, but the National Guard would form the army of the present. Behind these decisions were deeper concerns about the kind of army that the United States would need and how it would be built. In a private letter written in August of 1940, preserved by the National Archives, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed challenges facing the Army. Drawing on his own observations of military exercises, he noted that the American Army was lacking in modern equipment and that many soldiers were not yet prepared for modern warfare. He also warned that a purely volunteer system could create a dangerous imbalance, filling the ranks, but not necessarily with the skilled men the Army needed. The Army didn't just need more men, it needed the right men, properly trained for the kind of war that lay ahead. At the same time, concerns were growing closer to home. In late September of 1940, a classified report warned that German influence in Latin America could threaten the Western Hemisphere within a year. To American planners, the war was no longer distant, it was moving closer, and the oceans that once protected the United States no longer felt like enough. And concerns did not stop there. This same report outlined another growing danger, this time in the Pacific. American planners warned that Japan could act within months, possibly moving against the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, or Guam. Economic pressure from the United States was already increasing tension, and there was a fear that the Japanese might act quickly if they believed the United States would not respond. Even more concerning was the conclusion that followed, that the United States was not prepared and would not be prepared for several years. If war came sooner, planners believed that the response would be limited, relying on small naval forces, air power, and the efforts to disrupt Japanese shipping. In other words, the United States was facing the possibility of a war in both the Pacific and the Atlantic without the forces it needed to fight on one front, let alone two. This reality shaped decisions across the country. The Army didn't just need more soldiers, it needed a new kind of organization. Units were being reorganized, restructured, and reassigned to meet the demands of modern war. In the summer of 1940, the unit that would become Company B of the 193rd Tank Battalion was known as the 31st Light Tank Company, part of the Alabama National Guard stationed in Ozark. In early August, the 31st Light Tank, as part of the 31st Division, left for Louisiana, taking part in large-scale maneuvers along the Sabine River with the 3rd Army. Under the command of Captain Lewis Daniel Johnson, a veteran of the Rainbow Division in the First World War, the men trained for 3 weeks alongside other units of the 31st Division, operating as they had for years, part-time soldiers preparing for a war that had not yet reached the United States, but was rapidly approaching. When the 31st returned home later that month, there was still uncertainty about what would come next. Early reports suggested all the units of the 31st Division would be sent to Camp Blanding, Florida, including the Ozark Tank Unit, but by late November, that plan had changed. While other National Guard units prepared to move out, the Ozark Tank Company was notably excluded. This was not an oversight, it was part of a broader reorganization underway within the Army. Tank units were being pulled away from infantry divisions and reorganized into independent battalions better suited for modern warfare. As part of this reorganization, 4 National Guard light tank units would be combined upon activation to form the 193rd Tank Battalion. The 31st Light Tank Company of Ozark, Alabama, soon would be known as Company B and would be joined by 3 others. The 30th Light Tank Company of Forsyth, Georgia would become Company A. The 36th Light Tank Company from Houston, Texas would become Company C, and the 45th Light Tank out of Denver, Colorado would become Company D. In December of 1940, the buildup continued. Recruiting remained active, and as the unit expanded, new volunteers stepped forward to join the ranks. Among them were local men like James Carroll Jimmy Dunn, William Fremont Wiggins, Joe Mercer, and Teddy Dees, and more. These men were not drafted. They stepped forward before the full impact of the draft system was ever felt. At the same time, preparations intensified. Physical examinations were conducted locally at Fort Dale by military doctors from Fort Benning who arrived to evaluate the men. One final step before activation, orders issued in mid-December set the mobilization date for January 6, 1941. The company was expected to reach a strength of just over 100 men, though some vacancies still remained. On January 6, 1941, the transformation became official. The 193rd Tank Battalion was inducted into federal service. What had once been 4 local National Guard units was now part of the U.S. Army. Within a year, many of these men would be in Hawaii, and by the end of 1941, the war they had been preparing for would finally reach them. But in early 1941, it all began with events half a world away decisions made long before the first shot was fired.